Hello everyone, and welcome to my laser tutorial. In this video, I'm going to cover the basics, some key design choices, and show you a couple of examples of how you can build lasers. As usual, you can find chapters and timestamps below for your convenience. First, how does laser damage work? It's actually not super different from a standard kinetic projectile. Lasers have an armor piercing stat, or AP, and having AP equal or higher to the armor of whatever you hit will allow you to deal the advertised damage, modified by attenuation, aka damage lost over range. Note that firing through water causes significantly more attenuation to the point where you should avoid using lasers underwater as much as possible, even if it's technically allowed. Now back to AP. If you have less than the armor of what you hit, you will deal proportionally less damage. So if you have half the AP compared to the armor, you will do half the damage. Having more does not allow you to deal more damage. But, and this is a huge but, laser defenses work by reducing the AP value of the laser. This means you need higher AP values to keep your damage up against anything that uses smoke and or shields. If a laser pulse deals more damage than needed to break a block, it will move on and damage the block behind it, and so on, until there's no more energy in the pulse. This means that lasers can pierce targets, although overpen will waste any of the remaining damage. Now, what's different from kinetic projectiles is that lasers do not care about the angle at which you hit the blocks, and they also ignore armor stacking maneuvers. Alright, so what do the parts do? I'm gonna start from the end, as it will help make sense of some of the blocks later, I think. So there are 4 ways to fire your lasers. There's the standard combiner, the short-range combiner, laser cutters, and laser anti-munition system nodes, aka LAMs. You can have as many of all of those things connected to the same laser system as you want, and you can mix and match. So you can use the same system for your LAMs and for offensive combiners. Assuming you fire multiple combiners or nodes or whatever at the same time, this will simply consume more power from your laser system rather than dividing the damage across them. However, the time between each shot is global. If your laser system can fire once per second and one combiner fires, nothing else that is connected to the same laser assembly can fire for that 1 second. Now, the standard combiner, the standard combiner, here we go, without knocking the mouse this time, will let you fire at enemies as far as you can target them. The damage and the AP values are taken directly from the laser assembly without any specific modifiers, and you have a set accuracy of 0.05 degrees, or dispersion. Steering optics will allow you to fire at wider angles, and the regular optics will reduce the damage you lose over range. Then we have the short-range combiner. As its name implies, it has limited range. However, in exchange for that limited range, you can tweak a slider in the UI over here, focus distance, and this will affect the accuracy of the combiner, its max range, and it will offer a multiplier to AP and damage, as you can see. Now, it does reduce AP no matter what, but the damage does go up. All right. Then we have the laser cutters, which are pretty hard to see. There's this little beam between the two. Basically, you must get the enemy between those 2 nodes, those 2 laser cutter nodes. And they have a 10 times multiplier on both damage and AP, so they are extremely powerful, if a little bit awkward to use. Do note that feeding laser cutters requires a 0 Q switch setup. which I'm going to explain momentarily. And finally, we have LAMs, which will automatically target projectiles in range as long as you can detect them. You can modify the node's settings and limits on the projectiles that you want the LAMs to fire at. Just like the normal combiner, it has a 0.05 degrees of inaccuracy by default, which means it's extremely accurate. And they have attenuation as well over range, and you cannot improve it unlike the standard combiner, so it's just fixed. So the further your LAMs can fire, the more damage you lose. It's not impossible that this may change, but for balance reasons, at the time of recording, all projectiles in the game have an armor value of 20. Now, your lasers will have an armor piercing value, and your LAMs can very much have reduced AP from smoke, so be aware of that. Moving on. Now for the laser assembly itself, aka what determines how much damage and AP you have. Couplers, right here, are probably the most important blocks in the sense that what you do with your couplers has the most impact in how or on how your laser will function. The first decision is the number of Q switches that you connect to it. If you don't use Q switches at all, aka zero Q couplers, you will deal less damage per energy spent, but the AP value starts higher and scales better. I'll put some formulas on screen for you so you can pause to take a look at them quickly. So, zero Q couplers can also pulse 40 times per second, which means they fire essentially continuously, and they will have no downtime as long as there is energy available. The high fire rate and low damage per shot also makes zero Q setups the least likely to waste energy on overkill or overpen. If a coupler has anywhere between 1 and 4 Q switches attached to it, then it has a lower base AP, but better damage for the same amount of energy spent. Those values are the same regardless of the number of Q switches as long as there is at least one. The only difference is the amount of energy spent per shot and the rate of fire. But the amount of energy spent over time is actually the same. For example, a 1Q setup will fire the most energy per shot, but it can only fire once per second. A 2Q coupler will fire half the energy per shot, but will fire twice per second. And then 3Q fires 4 times per second, and 4Q fires 8 times per second, with the damage split accordingly. I'll go over the specific advantages of each Q switch setup later after I'm done explaining the other blocks. Now, all the couplers with the same number of Q switches will fire at the same time. This means that 2 couplers with 1 Q switch cannot fire twice per second. Instead, they will both fire once per second and combine their damage. Another interesting note about Q switches is that they can be shared if they are adjacent to other couplers, even though it doesn't seem to work visually. For example, this coupler reads 1 Q switch on the tooltip, and this coupler reads 1 Q switch on the tooltip, and the Q switch is here in the middle. And visually it looks like it's only connected to one, but it actually works on both. Please fix or change the graphics or something. I don't know. Anyway, this is how it works currently. All right, now that we have couplers figured out, we can start building cavity lines. And when I say cavity lines, I don't mean it in an abstract sense. For example, even on the same coupler, lines that connect to different sides do not interact directly. Functionally, they might as well be on different couplers with the same Q switch count. For example, right here, you can see that I've got pumps connected to cavities here, and then I have a storage cavity here and it's not charging. And as you can see, the coupler lists them as different beams. There are different styles for cavity lines, but the basic concept is always the same. Pumps connect to regular or single input cavities. And don't worry, you can't really get it wrong, because if you do, either the game won't let you place the pumps, or they will show up as red when you hover over your laser system. Don't worry about that. But if you do get it right, the pumps will convert engine power into laser energy that is stored in the cavities. The cavities themselves can be chained as long as space allows, basically. Now, when a laser fires, regardless of what fires it, it will draw a percentage of the energy available on each line. This is very important because it means that you should take special care that your lines have the same ratio of pumps and cavities. The exact length can vary. For example, if you have a line matching with another line and one of those lines is exactly twice as long as the other one and has twice the storage and twice the pumps, it's fine. But if you put a bunch of pumps on one line and a bunch of storage on another line, you will have issues. Even if there are some pumps on the other line, they won't drain at the same rate and they won't recharge at the same rate. So one line is going to end up empty, which will reduce your overall damage output. Then we have destabilizers, which also connect to cavity lines and only modify the line that they are connected to specifically. They increase how much energy is used every time the laser fires, which increases the damage. But it also increases the drain, which means that you will need more pumps to keep the lines supplied. So if we look at the tooltip right now, it says cavity energy used per shot 29, cavity energy percentage used per shot 0.25. And if we add a destabilizer, suddenly it's 56 and 0.48%. And then we have the frequency doubler. Those can actually be placed on a regular cavity line, but they can also be placed on doublers on their own without any laser energy or pumps or anything else, as long as the Q switch setup on the coupler corresponds to the Q switch setup on your couplers with actual laser energy. Doublers will increase the AP associated with that Q switch setup across all of the couplers that are part of your system. The actual amount of AP provided depends on the volume of pumps that are feeding that Q switch setup. The more pumps you have, the less AP per doubler. So if we look here, you'll see that we have a 0 Q setup that has 102 AP, and we have a 1 Q setup that has 40 AP. And if I add doublers on the 1Q setup, as you can see, the 0Q setup is still 102 AP and 60 AP for the 1Q now. And if we increase the number of pumps, like so, suddenly the AP has gone back down a little bit. So it is 56.7 on the 1Q setup. Alright, now that I've covered cavity lines, how do we connect everything together and make it work? Well, everything must somehow lead to one multi-purpose laser block per laser system. If you try to connect more than one to the same couplers, weirdness and badness will generally follow. Now, the simple way to connect things together is to use the connector blocks. Just make lines of connectors to all your couplers, to your nodes or combiners, just like this, and you're set. That's it. You're done. But you can't use those to connect to a combiner on a turret, for example. You could build a laser assembly on the turret itself, but there is a better way. Transceivers. Transceivers are super useful, not just for connecting to turrets, but also for connecting through other blocks. In fact, if the 2 points you need to connect are more than 20 blocks away from each other, then transceivers are simply better because they would be cheaper than the number of connectors you would need to use to reach those 2 points. Now, the direction of transceivers matters to some extent. It has to come from the multi-purpose laser block to the couplers and the combiners or the nodes. So for example, here we have a transceiver pointing into another transceiver that is connected to the multi-purpose laser block. And yet this is red and there's no beam and this doesn't work. This is because it needs to start from the multi-purpose laser, like this. This points into this one and this works. Now, the way the transceiver works, you can receive a connection from any direction, including the back and the front. That is fine, but the connection will extend only from the front. And as you can see here, if you have another transceiver in the way of this one, for example, it will break the connection because this one is receiving and it's not transmitting back to this coupler. So, as you can see here, I've set up a little demonstration of how couplers and connections work. So this is starting from a multi-purpose laser. You can go through even heavy armor if you want and connect there. You can go like this, you can go like that, and you can have couplers connected to each other. This is fine. But you can't use the coupler themselves to pass on the connection. So in this case, you see that the connection is going there, and I'm trying to pass through a coupler back into another coupler, and this is also red. There is no beam. It doesn't work. If we keep moving down, now we have transceiver into connector into another transceiver, and then the chain of couplers works, and then the other coupler later down the line also works. Then you need to connect to a turret. So if we keep moving down this line, you can see this all works. All of these examples work. This connects to the transceiver, then into the connector, and through the center block of the turret, where there is another transceiver receiving the signal and going into this short-range combiner. Note that if you stack these sub-objects like this, it also works. I don't need a transceiver between the sub-objects. I can even have blocks in between, and this is something I tested because recently this was not possible. It's now possible again, and in fact, you can even point those 90 degrees down. And if I pause the game, we can look, there is a beam showing that the connection is still correct. And yep, indeed, the tooltip still reads that this combiner is connected to the main block. So even though the transceiver is technically out of the way, the connection is still valid. And you can go pretty crazy. As you can see here, I have multiple sub-objects. It goes through the middle, off to the side, and then back through the middle of another sub-object, and this is fine. Finally, we have the output regulator. Now this block can connect directly to the multi-purpose laser, or you can connect it to a connector anywhere on the assembly. Even here would be fine. Now it's very useful, and I would generally put one on almost every laser, but there are specific cases in which you might not want to use one. What it does is relatively simple. Lasers normally drain a percentage of their current energy when they fire. This means that if a cavity line hasn't fully recharged between shots, then the next shot will deal a little bit less damage until you reach a point where your pumps are able to keep up. This also means that lasers will typically be a little inconsistent depending on your pump to storage ratio and how many combiners or nodes are firing. But it also means that your laser will almost never fully drain, if you don't use an output regulator, that is. The output regulator makes it so every shot is based on the maximum capacity of your lines, and will make your laser very consistent, at least until your cavities run out. It also gives a couple of extra options. If you press Q anywhere on the assembly, you will see that this thing appears, and it's not there if you don't have an output regulator. Now, the first slider allows you to reduce the percentage of your capacity used per shot. This is most useful for a laser that has a lot more storage than pumps. The other two options allow you to automatically stop firing the laser if the damage has fallen lower than the number you put here. Now, for better or for worse, changing this number also changes this. And this corresponds to the percentage of the energy available in your cavity. So in this case, 100 energy is 5% of the total charge available. It can be kind of useful, but it's also kind of annoying that the number changes. But you can tweak it afterwards. So for example, if my damage falls below 100 per shot, it will wait until it's recharged to 50.8% before firing again. That's it. Now for some examples of what you can do with cavity lines. This is the classic way to do it. You have your storage cavities on the left, and then you have regular cavities on the right surrounded by 3-meter pumps. And then very often you'll have these little bits at the end with frequency doublers. Now do remember that you can actually put doublers on their own couplers, so you don't necessarily have to have this little awkward bit at the end. But you can actually do something like this, and believe it or not, for the cost and the volume, this is actually almost perfectly the same as something like this. Now, obviously, it's going to use more blocks because it's just smaller blocks to achieve the same thing. But the main advantage of doing this is that you can actually weave in more doublers or even destabilizers on the same line. So this is just something that you can use to either have a more convenient form factor or to have a bit more specific design where you use, well, destabilizers for example. And you can, of course, offset it just a little bit to make room for Q switches. And you can also do something like this, where you mix in regular cavities with single input cavities to have a little bit more pumps. Now, generally speaking, using only regular cavities for this, there is a risk that you will actually have too much charging, too many pumps for the amount of storage, unless you use a fair bit more combiners or nodes to draw the power. But that's going to be it for this video. I've been talking for longer than I thought. I will make a more advanced tutorial at some point for lambs in particular, because I think they require a bit more finesse than just setting up a decent laser, and for more exotic setups for offensive lasers. So please consider subscribing and leave a like if you find my videos helpful. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.